That, yeah.
Okay, boy. Hi, this is Gabriel, broadcasting from the Cayman Islands. Today I'll be joined by Dr. Jairo Lugo from Northwestern University in Qatar. Jairo is a well-known researcher and scholar of journalism, and he knows Venezuelan affairs very well, and we'll be speaking about Venezuelan state of affairs as it stands right now. Hi, Jairo, welcome.
Thank you, Gabriel.
It seems like Juan Guaido's moment it's disappearing. Why is that? And what's in the future for your country?
Well, I think that there was a miscalculation about the degree of cohesion within the high command of the armed forces in Venezuela. And sadly, as in the history of Latin America over the past 100 years, at the end of the day, it's the military who decides everything. I think that President Guaido thought that people were turned their backs to Maduro. I think there was a miscalculation of the intelligence apparatus of Cuba and how it operates and how much grasp it has over power in Venezuela. And I think, they thought it was going to be easier than they were thought. I thought also they miscalculated the resolution so far of the United States to intervene militarily in Venezuela. And I think that the only red line that the United States really is going to respect is the fact that they won't touch Guaido. They won't put him in prison.
You think that still holds?
Yeah, I pretty much think that if the Venezuelan government does anything Guaido under the Trump administration, there will be severe consequences. I think that they know that. That's like one step too far. And also, Guaido has created a huge problem for the Venezuelan the regime, the Maduro regime, the Chavista regime, because he's actually controlling now most of the oil income. This coming through the refineries and the bank accounts. Let's not forget that over 60 countries now recognize Guaido as the legitimate president. And that, contrary to what a lot of people say and think, the time is not only running against the Guaido momentum, but it's running against the Chavista regime too. I mean, they don't have money to pay their public employees from the end of this month. That's a fact. They have no money after the end of the month. They're selling gold, they're selling diamonds, they're obviously making other ways of having the money. The Russians, for example, have just got almost for free 2 new gas developments, but that's not going to be enough. And at the end of the day, the Venezuelan state, as Chavez understood very well, is a client state. In other words, it's sustained by the bureaucracy. And if people don't get paid, that's now. If that's going to mean that people are going to turn around and oust Maduro, no, I don't think so. I think he has still a very strong grip over the army. I think that the visit of Cabello, of Diosdado Cabello to Cuba last week signals an important shift. Remember that the Cuban regime so far has refused to receive Cabello in La Habana for many years. And this is the past. So there's been some sort of pact now between the sector led by Cabello, who's going to be very strengthened by all this, at least momentaneously, and the Cuban government, who really controls the politics in the moment, and in this moment in Venezuela. But I think that the armed forces are still con Maduro, and this is going to be for a little bit while a show that we're going to have to see in the screens.
So the Gordian knot, it's the armed forces. So the opposition, if they are hoping for a change, they have to target the armed forces. So how can they be cracked down? What options are on the table in order to create that little crack through that, that can lead to a leak of everything else?
They thought that through Padrino Lopez and offering a place for power after a transition, they thought that was going to work. And it didn't work for a variety of reasons, including the fact that there was not sufficient guarantees that nothing was going to happen to them after a transition. And I think that's really the center of the issue. The Chavismo has also benefited from international affairs. So we've seen that in the past few weeks how the tensions with Iran not only has increased the oil prices, but also has distracted the United States from the more domestic hemispheric issues like Venezuela. And what's going on, the developments in Honduras, which are now threatening the government of Honduras, the situation of the government in Argentina, which is probably going to lose the next election and meant a return to the left wing. So the Chavismo is waiting, it's trying to survive day by day, gasping for air with the support of the armed forces, but they're not in a comfortable position, no, at all. There's a lot of problems. They don't have money, and this is all about money. I mean, this is not about power. In 21 years, the Chavismo has been completely unable to build an ideological base, except for a small 1.5 million, 2 million people which supports them. The rest, if you did our elections today, which were free, open, and internationally monitored, there's no doubt that any candidate from the position will win like they won in 2015 by an overwhelming majority. I keep repeating to people that the elections of 2015, when the parliament was taken by the opposition, was won by the opposition against all odds. It was impossible for the opposition to win that election. The electoral system was biased. Remember that the previous election, the 2011 election, was also won by the opposition. In fact, the opposition got 53% of the vote. But the way that the Chavismo had configured the constituencies for the parliament in 2011 meant that even though the opposition got 53% of the votes, the Chavismo got 60% of the MPs, of the members of parliament. In 2000,
but there's gerrymandering in all countries. I mean,
yeah,
Trump lost the popular vote, so it's...
I know. But on top of that, in 2015, not only the Chavismo had changed the constitution 6 months before, but also the Chavismo had closed several of the main media stations, had committed a lot of abuses, etc. So I have to recognize that the opposition won fair and square election in 2015 that it seemed impossible to win. And I think today, with the situation in Venezuela, with the really a critical situation of the economy, there's 4 million people outside the country who would all vote for the opposition, or a lot of them will vote for the opposition, and also inside. So there's no doubt that the political power is no longer in the hands of the Chavismo. The once popular regime among many is no longer popular. That's, they still have a strong base, like, a strong base of followers, or almost fanatical followers, but I don't think they have any more the political power. What they have is the force, the military power, and that's why they can create a parallel. So President Guaido is hanging on there. He's resourced there. I think he's been really severely affected by the case of corruption in the border with Colombia and Venezuela a couple of days ago, and of course it's risible to see the Chavismo criticizing the corruption there, when the amounts of the corruption in the government are huge, as trillions and trillions of dollars been stolen. But it has affected Guaido. He still have a strong followers, and I think that that in that case, he's still able to mobilize. You see, he can rally people still here and there. But I think that everybody's waiting. I personally am waiting. I think I'm personally waiting for a couple of possibilities, and all these are scenarios. And as many, over the years with Venezuela, you always make several scenarios, then you choose the worst one, and that's probably the one that's going to happen. and but one of the scenario has to do, of course, with the pressure that the United States can inflict. And if there's an arrangement with Iran, and not a war with Iran, then the United States is going to come back to Venezuela and Cuba and put pressure. And I think in that sense, we're going to have to wait October or November. Remember that for me, this is going to go back to the U.S. elections. One of the key states is Florida, because of what happened with the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and the response of Trump to the Puerto Rican people. He knows that one of the big dangers is that the Latino votes for the Democrat, for whoever is the Democrat presidential candidate. And And I think Trump knows that, and he calculates that, and his strategists know that. And I think solving the situation of Venezuela for Trump could mean basically dividing the Latino vote. He doesn't have to win the Latino vote. He just have to divide it enough, demobilize the people who would vote Democrat, and mobilize certain people to vote Republican, and that's it. That's all he needs to win Florida and other key states where Hispano-Latino communities are decisive.
But he has done pretty much everything that's available except an invasion. So let me ask you two questions. What other options are there available for Trump? And if there are no other options available, what would an invasion look like?
Well, the first thing I don't think that all the options are exhausted. The sanctions don't come into place immediately. A lot of the sanctions that the United States announced 4 or 5 months ago are just coming to place now. Because remember, oil tankers are in transit, contracts have been signed. When you impose sanctions on other countries, you have to take into account that you have to give for a variety of international reasons and law and regulations, you have to give it. So a lot of the sanctions against the Venezuelan government are starting to take place now. For example, the second biggest buyer of oil of Venezuela is India, and they just stopped buying oil 2 weeks ago. And they stopped 2 weeks ago because the sanctions, by the time that the sanctions were announced and put in place, India already had several contracts which could not rescind with Venezuela. But when these contracts finished 2 weeks ago, India say, I'm not buying any more oil. That's a big hit for Venezuela, very big hit for Venezuela. So I think there's still a lot of that the sanctions can do, but there's no doubt, of course, that the sanctions also exacerbate the life of people in Venezuela, not only the government, but the life of people in Venezuela, which was already bad enough beforehand. So I think there's still some options. There's still the possibility of a negotiated transition with China, Russia involved. The people think that this is all about ideology. It's also about money. China and Russia they know as a fact that while the current administration of Maduro is in power, they're not gonna get money back of their debts that they have. They're not gonna back. They're gonna, Venezuela defaulted with Rumsfeld, the oil company. The Rumsfeld had to put back all the payment restructure. That means there's a lot of money there. Now for China, which has invested something like $17 billion in Venezuela, that's a lot of money, but that's not life or death. But the $7 billion that Russia has with Venezuela, that's a big thing. That is a big thing for Russia. Russia has, the GDP the GDP is smaller than Italy. So for Russia to lose $7-8 billion, which has invested in Venezuela, that is a big hit. So I think that if you read the Chinese position and the Russian position, they already talk about a negotiated solution. No longer they're saying, oh, Guaido is not the president, it's Maduro. Now they're talking about negotiated. So there's some negotiation taking place. And remember, when Guaido came to power, it was suddenly. We have all given hope. We were not, we have surrendered. We have said, no, there's nothing going to happen. That's going to be another 20 years, these people there, or it's going to be so bad that nothing is going to happen. And suddenly we have Guaido and the whole thing. And the same thing could happen tomorrow, so that's thing. Now, having exhausted that, a military option is not off the table at all. I don't think like other people.
What would it look like? Would it look like Panama or would it look like Iraq?
Well, it depends what happened after the invasion. The invasion is easy,
Well, the post-invasion, would it look like Panama, which went to become a prosperous democratic country?
Yeah.
Or would it look like Iraq, which is a mess?
Yeah.
What does Venezuela resemble more? Does it resemble Panama on account of being Latin America and so on, or does it resemble more Iraq on account of its size, the difficulty of the terrain, and so on?
Well, I think if you had asked me this question 4-5 years ago, I would say to you it might look a little bit more like Iraq and less like Panama 5 years ago. But with the FARC demobilized and only the ELN in place, I think it will look more like Panama. The ELN, which is the only irregular army which would be able to organize anything inside Venezuela, doesn't have the strength of the size to do that. I think an invasion of Venezuela by the United States, which probably will carry on with other countries in the OEA and others, would probably keep the army in place, which is what they tried to do when they tried to outset Maduro on the 30th of April. It will look pretty much. They will. That was a very important signal. The fact that they tried to outset Maduro with the support of Padrino Lopez and the army. There's no doubt that Padrino Lopez was involved in this effort, and then he pulled back. But there's no doubt there was key figures in there.
But I'm pretty sure that Trump's advisors are not concerned about Venezuelan regular armed forces, but rather about colectivos, and they do have the capacity to do some harm. So yeah, maybe removing the government from power, it's easy, but what comes after? I mean, Venezuela has mountains. Venezuela has huge slums where these colectivos operate.
Absolutely sure, but and you're gonna have a couple of those colectivos operating on a irregular basis and trying to do an urban guerrilla. But none of these collectivos, the majority of the collectivos are non-ideological. And that's the big point. None of these are going to say, I'm going to go to the mountain to fight for the next 10 years. If you offer them a good offer, they're going to basically either pacify or integrate, or if you give them a specific area until you're going to be able to deal with them easier than you dealt with an irregular armed force. And don't think for a moment that these colectivos, these paramilitary groups operating in the shanty towns, that they are all with the Chavismo. If you remember, 3 years ago, there was a series of summary execution by the Chavista government of several of the key leaders of the colectivo. You remember, several that came on television and they say, oh, if something happens to me, I blame the government of Maduro. And next day the guy was killed. We remember this. You remember this 3 years ago. So don't think for a minute that all these collectivos are the government. And those are scores that people have. These are criminal gangs. Period. These are criminal gangs, and as criminal gangs, you can buy them. This is what the United States will probably do with this.
But Chavez invested huge amounts of money in ideological formation on these groups. Did he fail on that?
Absolutely.
I mean, because you could talk to people from Frente Francisco Miranda or other groups like that, and I mean, it's one thing what they may say in front of the cameras, and quite another thing that what they may say in private. But it does appear, at least what they show on cameras, that these guys are really convinced of a left-wing ideology and so on.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's many of them, more than would be, healthy, that are completely like Chavez used to say, nation socialism of death. Absolutely no. I have no illusion that there's not the case in many of the cases, but it's not as widespread. It's not Iraq, where there was a whole series of in Iraq. There was when Abraham decides to the governor of Iraq, the U.S. governor in Iraq decides to dismantle the army. Everybody told him, "This is crazy. What are you going to do?" Chavez has been dismantling the army for the past 20 years. That's what he was doing. He was fragmented. Venezuela has probably now, this is a joke, but there's probably some truth in it. So the joke is that Venezuela, if there's a war, the problem is not that they don't have good generals, it's that they don't have enough soldiers, because everybody's general there, So there is an issue here that the army is fragmented, is weakened. There's not a clear chain of command, but the whole country is like that. There's no institutional framework to work with. A lot of this is to rebuild things. From reteaching people to queue. Funny enough, we make these comments about the enormous queues, but actually the reality is that Venezuela nobody queues. The only people who queues are the people who can have no other options. So there's no, Chavez invested 20 years of ideological speech and ideological programs to politicize and ideologize people, and it worked to a certain point, but not to another. I mean, the fact that you have what they call bachaqueros, people who get the food controlled by the government and then resell it, or the images that you see of huge PDVSA, the oil company, trucks of gasoline crossing the border in front of everybody. These are really interesting indicator about how it's not ideological. It doesn't, they fail after all this year. If anybody, if after all this year, what the majority of the people in Venezuela want is to have money and to have a good living standard, and if anything, people in Venezuela have becoming more materialistic. It's not only, this is not a phenomenon of Venezuela. If you go to Cuba today and you take a plane to Cuba, everybody's trying to sell you something. It's completely monetized. I'm at the moment, as you know, I'm in Vietnam. There's no more capitalist society in the planet than Vietnam. This is absolutely, Adam Smith and David Ricardo would dream of this place, of the free market. Chinese don't have free health, If you're Chinese and you get ill, you die if you're poor, because you don't have free health in China. You don't have free education from preschool. If your children is in kindergarten or in primary school, you have to pay. Everybody has to pay in China. In Vietnam, I one of my best friends here in Vietnam, Anh Nguyen, who's a professor too, and his father was in prison during the Vietnam War, and after the Vietnam, he fought with the U.S. in the South, and he was in prison after the war for 10 years in a re-education camp. So when he came out, he had my friend. He was his first son. And one day he comes to England to visit me, and his daughter comes with him. And we, for one reason or another, we ended up eating in McDonald's. And he gets one of these toys from Disney. In that time, like 10 years ago, McDonald's still did Disney toys. I don't think they do it anymore. He opens the box, and because the girl didn't want to eat properly, he says, "I won't give you the toy unless you eat your burger." And then he started looking at the toy and says, "Jairo, look." And it was a Donald Duck made in Vietnam. He says, that's what, So the power of capitalism, and I'm sorry that this conversation is getting more philosophical, but I know you like philosophy, so.
Of course.
Okay. And the power of capitalism is that it not only creates, like what Polanyi used to call the market society, is that market society becomes the logic of society. All the logic. Now we might not like that because we have moral pluralism and we have reservation about what capitalism and utilitarianism and monetarism and commercialization like. But that is the reality, and that's the experience that is happening in Venezuela. The government opposed for 20 years the releasing, liberating, flexibilizing the currency control, because the worst thing, said Chavez, that could happen to Venezuela was to become dollarized like Argentina under Menem and Cavallo. You know what? Venezuela is completely dollarized now. You go to buy toilet paper, it's $4 a toilet paper. Everybody's accepting dollars in the street. Nobody's accepting bolivares. So this is the power of capitalism that the Chavismo didn't understand.
If capitalism reigns supreme, as you're saying, and whatever forces are supporting Maduro are not truly ideological, then why has the U.S. failed in providing a bribe for them? Because in a country that's so desperate for money, couldn't you just give some money to this general, that general, and turn the tables over? I mean, it seems to me that the fact that they still stubbornly remain there, rejecting bribes, suggests that they may have some ideological basis to what they do, despite everything that you have said. And I may agree with you that Ho Chi Minh may be revolving in his thumb, seeing everything that's going on in Vietnam.
Actually, let me correct you. Actually not. And I'm going to give you a hypothesis, although one should not say that what if history this and what. Actually, not what the United States didn't understand with Ho Chi Minh is that he was basically a nationalist more than a communist.
Okay.
He only became a communist because the United States started to support the South, and they didn't understand that this was a national project. But I'm going to give you something that some people will not like what I'm going to say, but I'm pretty sure that in the elections of 1961 or 61, when John F. Kennedy won the election, if that election had been won by Richard M. Nixon, the Vietnam War might have not happened.
All right, that's
And
fair enough. But let's get back to Venezuela.
okay,
So even though capitalism may reign supreme,
uh,
if that's the mentality that most Venezuelans have,
uh,
why hasn't the high command of the armed forces accept the money that's coming either from the U.S. or something else, somewhere else,
because,
and just
because
turn
what
their
I said,
back on Maduro?
because
What's at stake for them?
well, there's a lot of stake for them, and what I said earlier is that there is not sufficient guarantees for them that after a transition, nothing is going to happen to them. They're too in deep in some of the, people like Tarek William Saab, people like Tarek Alisami, people like Del Cabello who have strong relationship with alleged drug relations, according to the media, with drug cartels, with Hezbollah, with terrorist groups, etc. So this is people who, whatever happened, are going to be hunted down after a transition. Whatever happened, and this would have been the token. And this is the reason Cabello went to Cuba, and this is why Cuba, for the first time, receives him with all the honors, because there is trying to look within the Chavismo for some sort of solution. And Cuba is already realigning itself because it can no longer depend on Venezuela, which had been the safeguard. So the problem is that the military there is controlled very tightly, the elite of the army, and they have the biggest bureaucracy. I'm going to go back to the client state. The biggest bureaucracy at the moment in Venezuela is no longer PDVSA, is no longer the central government, is actually the army, and it's the one that holds the arms. And you only have to see that in the attempt of the 30th of April, we were very close to ousting Maduro. That's probably the closest we got since Chavez in 2002, in April 2002. Because there were more people involved from the Chavismo in this transition than we might think. And something went wrong. We will know exactly what went wrong in the next few years or decades. We will find out what happened. But one thing I'm pretty sure is that we were very close to that.
So you're saying that if these people were given good guarantees, maybe they might take the money and just walk away. Now, this leads us to another important topic here.
Can I just make a point on that retrospective?
Of course, go ahead.
Okay. This is the point. This I'm going to blame the Obama administration, which in foreign policy had been terrible, in my opinion, both in Syria and in the case of Venezuela. In 2015, when the opposition won the election, that's when the United States should establish a red line. In the moment that Maduro bypassed the Congress, that's where the United States administration should have done everything that the Trump administration is doing now. We would not be in this situation because at that moment, the framework of the country would have been completely different, and the transition would have happened naturally in that process. Okay?
Sure,
because
but you're
no presidential election on December this year. There would have been, but that moment, this I blame both the Latin American countries, which had been so far terrible, with the exception of certain moments, but mostly terrible, because while Venezuela had lots of money to offer, nobody complained about the Chavismo, because everybody was benefiting from that. But also the United States administration under Obama, which was being very, very quick with that. And that's the moment, 2015, that all of this very strong statement, all of these very strong positions about respecting the democratic rule of law, the Congress, etc., those should have been happening in that moment. Sorry to make that question, but that's something
no,
probably that historically we have to recognize.
It's a good observation, but the past is past. Let's focus on the present and, more importantly, the future. So you're saying that in 2019, if you give Tarek Al-Aissam and all these people good guarantees that they will be respected once they walk away, they might walk away. That's what basically you're saying, right?
No, I would say different. I think the problem is that you cannot give these people enough guarantees. There's no way that you can guarantee these people, key people in the government, that they're going to be okay after a transition. And they know that.
So having said that, you would say that there is no point in going to a dialogue in Norway, for instance, because they won't take any offer.
Well, there is the Norway conversations are, they're not neutral. I mean, Norway is one of the biggest partners of Roosevelt and other companies operating in Venezuela, and there is the reality is that the situation of Venezuela is beneficial for every single oil company in the world at the moment, because if Venezuela is producing only 850,000 barrels, which for the latest account, that's what is producing. That means that, plus the embargo from the sanctions of the United States, that means that the oil price is stabilized in the price that is stabilized. So I don't think honestly, I don't think there's a point to go to Oslo without two things happening. First, creating the type of guarantees for a transition, so key figures in the Chavismo know not only that they can be preserved, but certain things of power can be preserved. Something like happened in Nicaragua when Violeta Chamorro won the election, surprising election in Nicaragua. And one of the things that happened was that the brother of Daniel Ortega, remain as commander-in-chief of the armed forces through the whole government of Chamorro. People, remember this. So are we willing to do and provide those type of guarantees? More important, not if we are willing, can we provide those guarantees? And the answer is, I don't think we can. I don't think, but I might be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we can. Anything is preferable than having a death toll of hundreds of 200 people. We just saw President Trump in the United States, who had ordered initially a drone strike, a strike against Iran for the shutdown of the drone in the Persian Gulf, and then he backfired because he said, according to the latest report, that there were over 100 people who would have been killed if that wouldn't happen, and it's not worth it for a drone. And it's easy to talk. I hear people saying to Guaido, why don't you call the Article 187? Why don't you call the United States to intervene now? Why didn't you do it in the humanitarian operations? And it's easy to say those things and forgetting that, first of all, who are we to ask United States citizens, young people, to die in our name? Who are we? What right do I have to say to a young kid or 18-year-old kid from Dakota, or his mother or his father, let your son get a bullet in the chest? And I know this sounds romantic, and I'm not trying to be cheesy but I'm saying, I'm talking here about a principle, a moral principle, that if we can get rid of these people in peaceful manners and reestablish the rule of law and democracy, even if it's in a semi-functional way until we get something rolling, and we got, in a couple of years, we managed to rebuild the country without collectivos shooting from windows and without soldiers shooting to each other and without people. Well, let's give peace a chance, like John Lennon say. But am I optimistic that's going to happen? No way I'm optimistic. I have zero optimism that's going to be happening.
Okay,
and I think
if it comes down to an invasion, then, and we have to go back to it, because if you're pessimistic, then you're saying that it's the one option that's left. How would the U.S. avoid the illegality of it? Because an invasion of a country that has not invaded another country, it would have to go with a UN resolution approved by the Security Council, and Russia and China will likely block it.
Not not necessarily. It's, several. I mean, we're talking here like if Russia didn't invade Ukraine or the United or China didn't have concentration camps for Muslims or invaded Tibet.
Yeah, but all that is still illegal. How does the
I,
U.S. keep the higher
no,
moral
it's
ground?
not legal. The invasion of Ukraine was not legal. Was completely legal. It was done with
Exactly.
the regular
No, but that's
forces.
my point. How do you avoid illegality then if you're the
Okay,
U.S.?
I don't think that Trump is one of those presidents. From all the presidents in the United States, that's probably the one who's less concerned about that. About keeping the appearance. The whole idea of legality was kept by this insistence since the times of Woodrow Wilson. The insistence of U.S. presidents of performing as guarantors of a new international order. That was the way the United States, since the President Wilson at the beginning of the 19th century managed to confront the Soviet Union by saying, we are the guarantors of international legality. And that was an agreement all over the United States, all the way until recently. But by the way, Trump would not be the first United States president to bypass the whole Security Council and bypass all the international legality regulations of the United Nations. Clinton went into Kosovo with this figure that he completely invented called humanitarian intervention, which is not registered in any book or anything. He went into Kosovo and he invaded Kosovo, period. If countries want to do that, they will do it. I think in the moment that the Venezuela becomes a real security concern of the United States. And here it could be, as I said, I mentioned at the beginning that if there's no war from Iran with Iran, then we're going to see more negotiations happening because the United States will turn around back to Venezuela and try to fix that in a peaceful way without the pressure on Iran. If there is a war with Iran, you can make sure that the first invasion before Iran will be Venezuela, because the United States will have to guarantee a secure supply of oil, and that's very easy. Particularly if you control the Zulia state, you don't even have to control. Shanty towns are in Caracas; they're not in Maracaibo in that degree. You just have to cut the bridge, the Lake of Maracaibo, and then you control the whole the whole of Zulia state, and you can pump at least in 8-9 months you could be pumping an additional 1 million barrels of oil to the United States. So you will see that if it happens. And I think that's strategically speaking, that is a possibility. But I don't think there's going to be a war in Iran. I think there's going to be Trump, and it's the geopolitics of the situation. If the invasion happens, if there is an invasion to Venezuela, well, first of all, the communication it will not only be in Venezuela. I think that the general, what's his name, the commander-in-chief of the South Command of the United States, who very openly has said the moment that Guaido asks for our help, we're going to come. They know that any military operation in Venezuela passes through Cuba. They would have to neutralize Cuba one way or the other, either with another invasion or either completely isolating that country.
Let me switch to another gear. You've been calling Guaido president.
Yeah.
That will be disputed by Chavistas and so on. I mean, the president is Maduro because he was elected in fair elections and so on. That's their argument. What's your counter to that? How is Guaido president?
The Guaido is president because the only legal parliament elected was the 2015 parliament. The period where Maduro was elected finished in January this year. No longer Maduro is president by the constitution approved by Chavez and submitted by Chavez and approved by referendum, but also by the law. And Guaido has been elected president by the legitimate parliament in the way that the law establishes. Now, the only hole in all that is that in the law, it's provided that after 30 days, you would call elections. And that has been done. People don't see it, but it was called by the Supreme Court in the Venezuelan in exile with the position that it had to be, as long as the electoral authorities had been renewed. That has not happened. So legally, you cannot do an election with the current Supreme Court in exile or the Electoral Commission not being the same. So
Maduro Maduro was elected in July 2018, and
no, he was not elected.
Well,
No.
I'm trying to make the Chavista case, and
Okay,
you can
okay.
refute it.
Okay.
And he defeated. It wasn't a referendum, as in, let's say, the case of Saddam Hussein or other dictators where they win an election, but the under contender. No, he had a contender, Henry Falcon, and he defeated him.
Who was a Chavista and who participated in one election that was fraudulent, that was illegal, there was no call, with a electoral commission that had not been renewed, and an election that was on in a time that was not provided by the law, and he brought forward the elections when there was not the time. The election should have happened in December, and it didn't happen on the time. So there was not any conditions. There's no legality to the 2018 elections because it was called by the parallel parliament created by Maduro in 2016.
But that parallel parliament was also elected in a previous election in 2017.
Again, a year after the election of the real parliament, and in an election that was called only illegally. No, it's like me. I can go tomorrow and say, I'm the president. I'm going to call an election tomorrow, and 5 of my friends vote, and I said, well, I'm the president now. No.
Maduro claims that there is an article in the Constitution that allows him to call for a constituency.
Well, he would claim that, would he? But we voted in 2015, against all odds, against all the controls. The opposition won the election of the parliament. A year later, Maduro technically dissolves that parliament and create his own parliament to his image and his support. That's basically it. It's like, tomorrow, Jeremy, let me, for example, put a place where I lived for the past 21 years. Let's say next year in the general election, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK wins the election. And the Conservatives, before they give him power, Theresa May or Boris Johnson say, you know what, I don't like this result. I'm going to create my own parliament. So that, you can continue to do whatever you do, but the laws that you pass have no validity because my parliament now is the one who's going to determine which laws are valid or not. So that's exactly what happened.
They will say that there is a difference. That first of all, the British do not have a constitution as such.
No, they do have Britain has a constitution. It's just not a written constitution.
Okay. But they do not have that particular article that allows them to call for a parallel parliament, whereas the Venezuelan constitution does have an article for a constituency, which is the same article that Chavez used in 1999.
Yes, but that can only be called by in certain circumstances and by the parliament. In this case, by the parliament itself, that it has to dissolve. Because what happened with this is that this article of the National Assembly was used to bypass a legitimate elected parliament in an election again. By the way, the funny part is that election dissolved the parliament, but it didn't get rid of the electoral authorities or the president. So if you're going to call us a National Assembly, is to re-elect all powers, every single power. And that's not what happened. Okay.
We can agree let's agree for now, for the sake of argument, that, these elections were illegal and so on. However, you've used an additional word, which is fraudulent.
Yeah. Because
that implies that maybe they gave numbers that were not accurate and so on.
Absolutely.
Let me ask 2 questions here as a follow-up. First, what evidence do you have of that?
Okay.
And second of all, why do you presume that the 2015 results were not fraudulent, and then only 2 years later, all of a sudden, they do become fraudulent?
2015, they were not. Let me start with the last part. 2015, there were no fraud. It was impossible to be fraud because the government, the Chavista government, the one who lost the election, controlled the electoral commission, the army, which takes care of all the voting places, the systems of computing that made. So there was, is all the things that from which could be used to commit fraud were controlled by the government, and they still lost. Okay, and so that's the first answer. So it was impossible. It's like if you get a group of police officers and then a guy who they put in prison beats them up, and then you say, oh, is the guy use excessive force? How did they use excessive force when he was in the jail in the precinct of the police, and they controlled the weapons, they controlled there were 5 of them, the guy was on, and he still wins. And then you say, no, the guy was abuser. So here's the same. The government of Venezuela control all the systems that make or not doesn't make a election transparent, and they still lost. So that's why the 2015 is absolutely clear of the opposition winning against all odds. Why do I say that 2 years later is fraudulent? Well, it's not me who said it. It's every single expert. First of all, there was no international monitoring allowed, not from the UN, not from the Organization of American States. Only people who the government paid to come and see the election, and they put in nice hotels, who were sympathetic, socially sympathetic from all over the world, who came to see the elections. That was the only people who verified the election internationally. Secondly, the company hired by the government, who had for years worked with the government, Symantec, came out and say, there's fraud. There's no way that 8 million people voted here. We counted less than 2 million. And they rescinded the contract. And, there was no mathematical way that 8 million people voted in the election. It was a very low turnaround, and with literally no opposition.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Well, the first thing is the centers were empty. There's all these images from all over the place.
Says who? That's the thing. I mean, because all the evidence you're providing that the centers were empty. Says who? I mean, it's just a camera showing some people and it's empty. I mean, that's very easy to manipulate.
Well, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's a very good point. But again, I go back to the Symantec. The company that worked hired by the government said that there was fraud. The company in charge of this computing systems that counted the votes, they knew how many people voted, said that less than 2 million people had voted. The company that had control of the machines, this was not a company that was in favor of the opposition. It's a company that had been working for at least 15 years with the Chavismo, who had monitored every single election, who had sold them also radars, who have sold them military equipment. This company that had all this business with the government, and they still had many contracts. The situation was so bad that the company said, you know what, mate, this is too much. I cannot validate that. And they went out and they said there's fraud. So there's the evidence.
Venezuela has a long tradition of claiming fraud over the last 20 years. 2004 referendum, 2006 election, 2012 election. In each of those cases, most of the opposition leaders backed up and say, you know what, it wasn't fraudulent. We claimed it was fraudulent, but we just don't have proof enough. This happened in 2004. It happened again in 2006 when Manuel Rosales lost, even though he acknowledged that he lost, but there were still people saying that somehow he was kidnapped by the government and he was forced to accept because he had actually won and so on. Many conspiracy theories going on. 2012, it was claimed that Enrique Capriles won. Apparently, he disputed that election, but then eventually he backed up again.
Yeah.
Why would this time be different, given the history of false accusations of fraud?
Well, this time is different because it's because of logics. First of all, I don't think it's different. I do think that Capriles won the election, and a government, the difference of election was 150,000 votes, supposedly in favor of Maduro, and the government refused to recount. Now, in a country where you have technically you could have 12 million voters, you know, and one of the candidates loses for 150,000 votes, you would have a recount in every single place in this planet that has working democracy. So let me start by that. So I don't think it's different. Or I think there was fraud on that one, and I think, and in fact, it's not exclusive of El Chavismo. We there's strong suspicions when Andres Velasquez lost elections from when Caldera that. Funny enough, he was supposed to stolen the elections because there were fear of a left-wing government coming to power. So the people decided that Caldera would have been a better option, which ended up not being, in my opinion. So that time of the fraud is not unique to the Chavismo. But obviously, what we do have in this case is the logics and the rationale and the reasoning of what happened. Venezuela in 2015 did not have the severe problems that it had in 2016 and 17. And in 2015, when the government was still relatively strong economically, when they were still not the crisis, the opposition won. Now, you explain to me how on earth the opposition is going to lose 2 years later when the economic situation has become worse. When the people, no, I'm just using the logics of but regardless of that,
it's not a smoking gun. That argument is not a smoking gun.
Okay, it's not a smoking gun, but this is the only legitimate election, and this is the bottom line. The only legitimate election in the past few years has been the 2015 election. That was the last election that were legally speaking, technically speaking, we can argue was a proper election. The 2018, the national constitution, there were elections which from the beginning there were serious doubts about it. The opposition refused to go to the National Assembly election because precisely they know it was going to be fraudulent and manipulated, and rightly so they didn't go. Because why? If it was not the case, if the National Assembly election was fair and square, why the opposition that just a year before won an overwhelming majority in the parliament would not go to another election? They would have. They would have controlled, because with controlling the National Assembly, they could destitute Maduro immediately. They could call for a presidency, change the constitution. Why didn't they go? Because they know it was going to be fraudulent.
Jairo, we're out of time. Give us your email address where some of these, or not your email address, but your Twitter account or anywhere they can reach you, because I'm sure listeners will be most interested in asking you questions directly. So go ahead.
It's Jairo Lugo, at Jairo Lugo.
At Jairo Lugo via Twitter. It's been my pleasure, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I'm trying to, I'm trying to resemble Tim Sebastian from Hard Talk.
Okay. Take care.
All right.